Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH, and today we're looking at Urza Lord High Artificer. Now this is absolutely a CEDH deck, and it's one of the best of them. So this deck is built around Urza Lord High Artificer, a 4-mana 1/4. When it enters, you make a construct, which is a XX token, where X is the total artifact count. So it's at least 1, but it'll often be bigger because of, all the other artifacts in the deck. Then it's got tap and untapped artifact you control to add blue. So any artifact, regardless of whether it's a Mana Rock, becomes a Mox Sapphire. And then finally, 5 mana, shuffle your library, then exile the top card until end of turn. You may play that card without paying its mana cost. So it's an infinite mana outlet and potentially infinite mana generator using various combos of cards in the deck. So what is the deck doing? So first, let's just talk about the straight up combos. So Aetherflux Reservoir. If we have a way to continuously play spells over and over, will just gain us tons of life until we can Death Star Laser the opponent using the pay 50 life ability. And we do have ways of looping spells in the deck, which we'll get to later. We've got the Dramatic Scepter combo in Isochron Scepter plus Dramatic Reversal. So if we have mana rocks that produce at least a total of 3 mana, or in this case, 3 artifacts, because Urza, we can use Isochron Scepter to imprint Dramatic Reversal. Then we can cast it, untapping both Isochron Scepter and every other artifact that we have. And then use Urza, or just if they're mana rocks naturally, produce 3 mana to keep tapping Isochron Scepter over and over, generating infinite mana. Anytime that we generate infinite mana, we can then use that mana to pay into Urza to spin the wheel on the final ability and win the game that way. We've also got Power Artifact. It reduces the cost to activate artifacts by 2. So this goes infinite with Basalt Monolith and Grim Monolith. Although it does not produce infinite blue, but it does produce infinite colorless, which again can just be dumped into Urza. Rings of Bright Hearth also goes infinite with Basalt Monolith and certain other combinations of things depending on what you have. Forsaken Monument, every permanent taps for an additional colorless mana if you tap it for a colorless mana. So this also goes infinite with Basalt Monolith, and just all of our artifact rocks that produce colorless rather than blue can produce double colorless instead of being tapped by Urza. And it just means that our colorless lands also produce additional mana. And then finally, this is a polymorph combo deck. So there are many creatures that you might want to play in an artifact-based deck, like the Trinket Mage, Tribute Mage, maybe, just like lots of creatures that have artifact synergies. But in this deck specifically, we're doing the polymorph strategy because the creatures that we can get off polymorph are much better than normal. So polymorph destroys a creature and then cycles off the top of your deck until you find another creature and puts it directly into play. Proteus Staff will basically do the same thing. Put target creature on the bottom of its owner's library, reveal cards until you find another creature, put it onto the battlefield. And in this case, we don't have any creatures in our deck except for Hullbreaker Horror and Tidespout Tyrant, which are both creatures that whenever you cast a spell can bounce a permanent. And in this case, we have Urza, which produces a Construct token, so we can just polymorph the Construct token and find one of these 2 cards. Now, what does that help us do? Well, we have lots of 0 mana artifacts in our deck, like Chrome Mox, Everflowing Chalice, Jeweled Amulet, Mana Crypt, etc. So as long as we have 2 0 mana cards, we can just loop them with Hullbreaker and Tidespout, bouncing them back and forth over and over, and we can keep tapping them for blue based on Urza. Or if they tap for mana by themselves, we can also loop those. So let's say you have like a Mox Opal and a Soul Ring, and somehow you don't have Urza in play, right? Well, you just go tap Soul Ring for 2, cast Mox Opal, trigger Tidespout, bounce Soul Ring back to your hand, tap Mox Opal for blue, cast Soul Ring using one of the mana that you have floating, bounce Opal back to your hand, tap Soul Ring for colorless, and you go infinite that way. And there's lots of various combinations of artifact rocks that you can play that will go infinite with Tidespout or Hullbreaker Horror, as long as you produce more mana than it costs to cast both of them. But usually, with many different combinations of mana rocks or just Urza, you can go infinite mana with Hullbreaker / Tidespout Tyrant and then various mana rocks, and then dump all the mana into Urza and win the game. And you can win the game either by just triggering Tidespout over and over and over to like bounce all of your opponent's permanents, or just Aetherflux Reservoir and then Death Star Laser everyone. So of course, we are then going to want a bunch of other cards in the deck. So we've got some fast mana and Jeweled Lotus and Lotus Petal. We've got 1 piece of removal and Chain of Vapor, which can sometimes be used to save Urza, or just replay Urza if we need another construct for some reason. We've got our card draw spells in Mystic Forge, Remora, Paradoxical Outcome, Recurring Insight, Rhystic Study, The Ring, Throne of Eldraine, and then we've got a bunch of wheel effects, Time Spiral, Time Twister, Windfall. We've got our counter spells to protect Urza and stop opponents, as well as Muddle the Mixture, which can be transmuted for combo pieces like the Dramatic Scepter combo. We've, of course, just got a ton of ramp, which is a bunch of artifact rocks, keys like Voltaic Key and Manifold Key that can untap mana-positive rocks like Mana Vault, but it can also untap the ring and whatnot. Sapphire Medallion to reduce the costs of blue spells. And then, of course, all of these cards can double up as combo pieces, especially Basalt Monolith. We, of course, have our tutors to find all of this stuff. So Fabricate to get an artifact. Moonsilver Key finds artifacts that have mana abilities, which can include stuff like Basalt Monolith. Mystical Tutor, Reshape, Tezzeret the Seeker, Transmute Artifact, and Whir of Invention. Then we got Sensei's Divining Top because it's just a solid artifact that we can use to fix the top card of our deck. We can tap it for blue mana with Urza. We can draw a card with it. Astrolabe is in here because it can just be a card that comes down, draws a card, and then we can tap it for blue with Urza, so it's kind of free. And then Aether Spellbomb, similar kind of thing where it's like protecting Urza, like similar kind of thing as like Chain of Vapor, where it can just bounce opposing creatures or protect Urza by bouncing it and then replaying it. One Cyclonic Rift as a sweeper. We also just make a ton of mana in this deck to begin with, so Omniscience and one with the Multiverse are fairly solid cards to play. Copy Artifact can just be a good additional artifact for whatever, like we can copy a Sapphire Medallion, etc. Seagate Restoration, again, we're making so much mana that sometimes we might just cast this. Lands are pretty straightforward, mostly blue lands, but we also have some things that are worth noting. War Room to draw Urza Saga to tutor up either just good stuff or just make construct tokens. Mycosynth Gardens to copy artifacts. Various lands, including fetch lands, to get Mystic Sanctuary and whatnot to get spells back. An Otawara, an Inventor's Fair to tutor artifacts. A Minamo to untap legendary permanents, which is mostly relevant just for the ring, but you may as well have it. Cavern of Souls to make Urza uncounterable. Blast Zone, and Ancient Tomb and Academy Ruins. Now, this deck is obviously going to have really big problems against Null Rod and Collector Oof effects, which is why it is important to have effects like Blast Zone, like Chain of Vapor in order to deal with those cards, because this deck does absolutely get shut down by Null Rod effects. Although Urza can still tap the artifacts for blue even under a Null Rod, but it does prevent you from activating other things. And then finally, stacks pieces. So Urza goes really, really well with a number of these stacks pieces. So first of all, we've got Back to Basics, which although we do play a fair number of basics, we also play a fair number of non-basics, and Urza just allows us to tap our stuff for blue, and we just have a ton of mana rocks anyway. So it does a pretty good job. Narset prevents our opponents from drawing extra cards and pairs up very well with our wheels. And then lastly, Urza and the artifacts. So old artifacts have a unique quirk where a lot of them are templated so that their effect doesn't actually doesn't apply anymore when they become tapped. And because Urza can tap them for mana, it can make a lot of these one-sided. So we've got Winter Orb, where players can't untap more than one land per turn, but you can, at the end of the opponent's turn who's right before you, just tap Winter Orb, and then when it goes to your turn, the Winter Orb effect doesn't apply. You untap everything as normal, and then the Winter Orb continues to apply to the rest of the table. Same thing with Trinisphere. You can have this Trinisphere out to screw over your opponent's ability to chain a bunch of spells together, and then if you ever get to the point where you want to chain a bunch of spells together, just tap the Trinisphere. Torpor Orb does not have that same effect, but the only card in your deck that's actually a creature with an ETB trigger is Urza, and it's not strictly necessary that you make that construct, so the Torpor Orb can be useful against other decks, one of the big cards being Thassa's Oracle. You've also got Tangle Wire to keep stuff tapped down, although only for a limited time, and once again, you can pair it pretty well with Urza. And then Static Orb is another card like Winter Orb that's extremely good with Urza. If Static Orb is untapped, players can't untap more than 2 permanents during their untap steps. So again, you just wait until it's the end of the player who's going right before you. On their end step, you tap the Static Orb down, you untap as normal, but a Static Orb remains untapped during everyone else's turn and continues to tax them out. So Urza is a deck that is actually one of my favorite commanders, but I personally don't like the stack strategy. But these orbs are so good that it's basically just incorrect not to play them in the Urza deck. So I've never built Urza in paper myself, but I do like everything that it's doing. So to recap, the main thing you're doing is use Urza to generate a ton of mana and potentially put together infinite mana combos. There's various infinite mana combos that you can put together, and once you do, you can spin Urza to find your entire deck, and then win by either just casting so many spells that Tidespout Tyrant bounces all of your opponent's permanents back to their hand, and then you can just kill them by like bouncing Urza and replaying it and making a bunch of Construct tokens and then killing them with the Constructs. Or you can just use Aetherflux Reservoir to Death Star Laser everyone in the game. Some versions of Urza might just play Oracle as a clean win. You can also, although this doesn't technically kill your opponents, use Narset plus one of the wheels to empty their hands while keeping your hand fresh, which again, it doesn't technically win the game, but it effectively wins the game. And those are the main ways of winning with Urza. You also have the Polymorph and Proteus Staff to usually tuck the Construct token and put Tide Spout and Hullbreaker directly into play and win that way. And that is Urza, Lord High Artificer, and EDH.